Airports are strange theaters. People rush past each other, some anonymous, some powerful, yet all equal under the impatient gaze of departure boards. But sometimes, the fragile balance of respect and authority breaks in ways nobody expects. This is not just the story of a flight delay. It's the story of a man who wore dignity like armor, a man whose entire career was built on fairness and justice shed in a single moment at a boarding gate. He was treated like nothing. What happened next shocked passengers, rattled the airline, and, within hours, made headlines across the country. The man was Justice Alan Price, one of the most respected federal judges in the United States. Known for his calm wisdom and unshakable presence in courtrooms, Price wasn't just any passenger. He was a symbol of authority and integrity. And on that day, his destination was Washington, D.C. to deliver a keynote speech about equality before the law. Irony has a cruel sense of timing. When boarding was called, Judge Price, dressed in his usual understated elegance, a tailored navy suit and polished shoes, stepped forward to take his seat in first class. He had reserved it months in advance, not out of luxury, but necessity. At 68, with a bad hip from years of long hearings, comfort wasn't an indulgence. It was survival. But as he handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, something shifted. The young employee scanned it, frowned, and then, with a dismissive laugh, said, "Sir, this isn't valid for first class. Please step aside." Price, ever courteous, replied, "Perhaps you've misread. That's seat 1C. The agent looked again, then rolled his eyes. "You must have upgraded with points. First class is reserved for premium travelers. Economy boarding is that way." The words carried more than a mistake, they carried judgment. The tone was laced with contempt, the kind that stripped a man of identity and reduced him to a stereotype. People nearby shifted uncomfortably, sensing the insult but unwilling to intervene. Justice Price stood still, gripping his cane, eyes calm but piercing. He could have argued. He could have revealed who he was. But instead, he said softly, "Son, respect is not a seat you assign, it's a seat you earn." The employee chuckled dismissively and waved him aside as if swatting away a problem. Passengers stared, shocked that such words were aimed at a man of his stature. Price walked down the jet bridge anyway, his silence louder than protest. He took his rightful seat in first class. But the sting of that moment hovered like a storm cloud. What no one knew was that within the hour, that single act of disrespect would ripple into something far greater. Passengers would whisper, phones would record, and when the judge finally spoke, the entire cabin and the entire flight would come to a halt. Because sometimes, when dignity is denied, justice doesn't wait for the courtroom. The hum of boarding filled the narrow aisle as passengers shuffled past with bags bumping against armrests. Justice Alan Price sat quietly in seat 1C, adjusting his cane against the wall, his face composed but unreadable. To anyone who didn't know him, he was just another older gentleman. But those who did recognize him whispered cautiously, eyes wide. The man who had presided over some of the nation's most pivotal cases was sitting right there, yet only minutes earlier. He'd been told, "You don't belong here." The sting of those words hadn't faded. Passengers who overheard were still buzzing. Some muttered their disbelief. Others pretended to bury themselves in their phones, afraid to react. A few quietly recorded the gate exchange, sensing that something extraordinary had just unfolded. When the last passengers boarded, the cabin settled into the usual pre-flight rhythm. Flight attendants moved briskly through the aisles, storing bags, offering polite smiles, and making sure every detail was in order. But beneath the polished routine, tension simmered. The same gate agent who had dismissed Judge Price entered the cabin, speaking to a senior flight attendant in hushed tones. Their eyes darted toward 1C. It was clear they still doubted him. Then, the announcement came. "Ladies and gentlemen, please ensure your seatbelts are fastened." The judge closed his eyes briefly, as if preparing for another battle, not in a courtroom this time, but in the confined theater of an airplane. Moments later, the flight attendant approached. Her voice carried that brittle politeness trained into airline staff, but it trembled slightly. "Sir, there seems to be a mistake with your ticket. This seat may not be yours after all." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, staring now, no longer able to ignore the unfolding scene. Judge Price opened his eyes and studied her calmly. "I have the ticket," he said, handing it over once more. "I purchased this seat myself." The attendant glanced at the boarding pass, then back at him. She hesitated, but the gate agent behind her whispered sharply, "Remove him." That word "remove" hung in the air like smoke. Price's jaw tightened. He leaned slightly forward, his voice still measured but carrying the unmistakable weight of authority. "Young lady," he said, addressing the attendant, not the agent, "do you know who I am?" The question wasn't asked with arrogance, it was asked with the calm gravity of someone who had spent a lifetime defending truth. The attendant shook her head nervously. "I am Justice Alan Price of the United States Court of Appeals. I am en route to deliver a speech on equality under the law, and yet here, in this cabin, I am told I do not belong." The silence that followed was deafening. Passengers leaned forward. Someone whispered, "My God." The gate agent's smirk faltered. The attendant froze, realizing the weight of the man's words. The entire first-class cabin, wealthy executives, celebrities, lawyers, watched with rapt attention. Justice Price didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply placed his cane across his knees and said, softly but firmly, "Until dignity is restored, this plane will not fly." The declaration sent a chill through the cabin. Phones came out. Recordings began. Something irreversible had just been set in motion. The cabin air grew heavy, as if the oxygen had thinned. Justice Price's words echoed. "Until dignity is restored, this plane will not fly." For a long moment, nobody spoke. The hum of the engines idling outside was the only sound. Then came the ripple. Passengers began whispering. A woman in the second row muttered, "I saw what happened at the gate. He's right." A businessman behind her nodded, but kept his eyes down, afraid of becoming involved. The gate agent, still standing in the aisle, bristled with anger. "Sir, with all due respect, this is not your courtroom, this is an aircraft. If you don't comply, we'll have security escort you off." Gasps. A few passengers shook their heads. Others pulled out their phones, now openly recording. The moment had transformed from a misunderstanding to a confrontation. Justice Price didn't flinch. His calmness was unnerving, almost regal. He raised a hand slightly, silencing the low murmurs around him. "Young man," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades on the bench, "this may not be my courtroom, but respect is not bound by walls. When a person in uniform abuses authority, it is my duty, whether in a courthouse, a street, or a cabin, to call it to order." The gate agent's face flushed crimson. He sputtered, but before he could speak, another voice cut through the tension. "I can confirm he belongs here," said a woman across the aisle. She held up her phone, displaying her recording of the boarding process. "I watched him show his ticket. You humiliated him in front of everyone." A ripple of agreement spread. A man in row 3 chimed in. "She's right. We all saw it. This isn't about tickets, it's about how you treated him." The tide was turning. What had begun as a private slight was now a public trial. The captain, alerted by the murmurs and the cluster of phones raised like witnesses, stepped out of the cockpit. His presence was commanding, his uniform crisp, his expression one of forced calm. "What seems to be the issue?" he asked. The gate agent spoke quickly, trying to seize control. "This passenger is refusing to move from a seat that isn't his." Justice Price looked up, eyes steady, and handed his boarding pass directly to the captain. "You may read the truth for yourself." The captain studied the ticket. His brow furrowed. He looked at the manifest, then back at the judge. A long pause followed, broken only by the collective thrum of held breath. Finally, the captain said, "This seat is indeed his." A low murmur of vindication swept through the cabin. Some passengers clapped softly, others exchanged knowing glances, but Justice Price wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his voice grave but steady. "Captain, this flight carries not only passengers, but principles. If a man of my station can be treated this way, imagine how others without titles, without recognition are dismissed daily. This plane will not move until that truth is acknowledged." The captain, caught between authority and conscience, stood silent. The agent fidgeted, sweat forming at his brow. And then, the shocking moment began to take shape. One by one, passengers raised their voices. "He's right. This isn't just his fight, it's ours. Treat him with respect, or this flight goes nowhere." The cabin transformed into a courtroom, and in that courtroom, Justice Alan Price had already won the jury. The cabin was no longer an airplane, it was a courtroom. The jury sat in reclining seats, their eyes fixed on the man in 1C. Justice Alan Price hadn't raised his voice, hadn't shouted or threatened, yet his quiet resolve had transformed a routine boarding into a trial of conscience. The captain shifted uneasily, caught in a crosswind of responsibility. Airline policy demanded order, but the truth on the boarding pass was undeniable. The gate agent stood stiffly, arms crossed, face twisted with resentment. Justice Price broke the silence. "Captain," he said softly, "I am prepared to leave this aircraft if that is your decision, but I will not leave quietly. I will leave with my testimony." He gestured toward the dozens of phones recording. Every passenger here has become a witness, and every witness carries the truth beyond these walls. The words carried the finality of a gavel strike. Passengers nodded, some whispering "that's right," others raising their phones higher. The captain looked at the agent. "Apologize," he ordered flatly. The agent scoffed. "To him, he's just enough." The captain's voice cracked like thunder. "This man is not just anything. He is a paying passenger. He has every right to sit here." But before the captain could say more, Judge Price lifted his hand. His face was calm, his eyes steady. "No," he said firmly. "This is not about me alone. If I accept a hollow apology, the stain of this moment remains. I ask for something more, acknowledgement, not to me but to everyone watching." The agent faltered. "What do you mean?" Price's gaze swept the cabin. "Tell them why you doubted me. Tell them why you looked at a man of my age, my color, and assumed I did not belong. Only then can we move forward." The cabin froze. It was a demand for truth, not revenge. The agent's mouth opened, then closed. He shifted, visibly shrinking under the weight of dozens of eyes. Sweat glistened at his temples. For the first time, arrogance gave way to fear. Passengers began to press. "Say it. Own what you did. Man up." The pressure built until the agent's voice cracked. "I assumed he wasn't first-class material. I shouldn't have. I was wrong." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Justice Price nodded once, the slightest gesture of recognition. "Then let this lesson fly farther than any aircraft," he said. "Respect is not reserved for the wealthy or the known. It is owed to every human being, without condition." The cabin erupted into applause. Some stood, clapping loudly, others cheering softly. The sound swelled like a verdict delivered. The captain, shaken but resolute, spoke into his radio. "This flight is delayed until further notice." And with those words, the plane was officially grounded. Phones lit up. Social media posts began firing into the digital sky. By the time the cabin door closed again, the world outside already knew. A federal judge had stopped a flight, not with force, but with dignity. The roar of applause inside the cabin faded into an echo that would stretch far beyond the airport walls. Phones buzzed as videos uploaded in real time. Hashtags forming like storm clouds across social media. Hashtag justice in the sky. Hashtag respect first. Hashtag grounded by truth. Justice Alan Price remained seated in 1C, cane resting across his lap, his composure unshaken. He had not shouted, not demanded revenge, yet the flight was stopped, the cabin transformed, and the airline now scrambling to contain a wildfire that was already out of their control. Within an hour, news outlets picked up the story. A shaky 30-second clip, Price leaning forward, saying respect is not a seat you assign, it's a seat you earn, spread like lightning. Millions watched, shared, and commented. Strangers called him a hero, while others confessed the story gave voice to their own silent humiliations. But inside the plane, before disembarkation, came the most poignant moment. The captain approached Price, his uniform immaculate but his eyes heavy. "Sir," he said, lowering his voice so only the front rows heard, "in my 20 years, I've never seen a cabin rise for one man like that. You've reminded me what authority should look like: calm, firm, and rooted in dignity. I'm sorry you had to prove it here." Price offered a faint smile. "Captain, authority means little if it cannot be used to protect the dignity of others. Today, we protected more than a seat, we protected a principle." Passengers began filing out, some pausing to shake his hand, others whispering thanks. A young woman, eyes wet with emotion, placed her palm on his arm and said, "You spoke for all of us." The gate agent, now pale and subdued, lingered awkwardly near the door. Justice Price did not glare, nor did he dismiss him. Instead, he spoke one final time, words meant for everyone within earshot. "Let this be remembered. Prejudice can board a plane, but dignity will decide if it flies." It was the closing argument of a lifetime delivered not in marble halls of justice, but in the cramped aisle of a commercial jet. The video of those words would be replayed on evening news, quoted in op-eds, and studied in law schools. By nightfall, the airline issued a formal apology. By morning, Justice Price's face graced every news cycle, not as a victim, but as a reminder that dignity, when defended, can halt even the unstoppable machinery of modern life. The flight never left that afternoon, but in the eyes of millions, something far greater took off. A lesson about respect, authority, and the quiet power of standing firm. And so, what began as a moment of humiliation ended as a historic act of defiance. The judge who was told you don't belong had grounded a plane with nothing but words and, in doing so, lifted a nation into reflection.